Hello and welcome to episode 162 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Erin Keane. Erin Keane was born in New Jersey and raised in Kentucky and feels both states are misunderstood. Runaway, Notes on the Myths That Made Me, her debut full-length nonfiction book, is a memoir and essays about her parents' pop culture gender. Parents/pop culture/gender. She's also the author of 3 collections of poetry, Demolition of the Promised Land, from 2014 Typecast Publishing, but out of print, Death-Defying Acts from WordFarm 2010, and the Gravity soundtrack from WordFarm 2007. She's editor-in-chief at Salon, and she writes mostly about culture and drinks, including the cocktails and mindfulness column, The Oracle Pour, in which she dresses her writing about life up in drink recipe clothes. She's a public radio alum and daily newspaper trained, and she cut her teeth in the beautiful wild world of the alt weekly. Erin is a member of the graduate faculty of Spalding University's Senna Nasland Karen Mann School of Writing, where she teaches creative nonfiction, poetry, and professional writing. Thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm ready to just get into it. I have so many questions,
Let's do it.
and so many compliments. I would love to know about growing up. A lot of the book of Runaway is about, there's a lot in the book about how your mom mothered you because of her life experiences. But I'd love to know specifically about your reading and language and words. I mean, were you like the kid who was at the library all the time? Were you a huge reader? I know that a lot of the book too is about myths, and your dad is a storyteller. So I just wonder about kind of a broad thing, but just about storytelling and words and language and how those shaped you as a kid.
Absolutely. I can't remember a time before I could read. So I know I was a very early reader. But my parents were both big readers. We always had books. And my mom read to us when we were little, and she loved to read us poetry as well as stories. So yeah, some of that was T.S. Eliot, and you would think that. So yes, some of the Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, but also The Hollow Men, which is a poem she loves and had memorized at one point and can recite it at the drop of a hat. This is a thing in my family. I'm probably the published poet who doesn't actually memorize poems, but my grandfather, the colonel who's in the book, had a habit of breaking into like Gunga Din. He really liked Kipling. He's a military guy. So at the drop of a hat. So we, my whole family is big readers, and I was always encouraged to read whatever I wanted to. There were no restrictions. And for those of us who I'm 46, so I grew up in that time before the big like YA, rich children's literature kind of boom, right? Like kids now, or even just millennials growing up, they just had access to a very different, I think, book landscape than we did. So once you kind of graduated from like kid kind of chapter books, you could read things like, and which I did, The Babysitter's Club and, Nancy Drew, devoured those. But I just wanted to read. And so I went to adult books pretty much immediately, reading a lot of things that went above my head, I'm sure, at the time. But, that was part of my mother's parenting philosophy. She was very strict about a lot of things, but music and books, we could listen to whatever we wanted. I don't think that my mother predicted the rise of gangster rap in the 90s, but to her credit, she let us go with as well. She really held fast to those values of like not censoring music and not censoring books. She was a little more circumspect about things like movies and TV and violence, on screen, but being given permission, not just permission to read whatever I wanted, but also seeing that like a lot of what I wanted to read was on my mom's bookshelf, being in a house full of books really, I think that it instilled in me at an early age that this was a great way to entertain yourself, especially in the days before the internet.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for that. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I've been reading this to my kids recently. I wonder if you can identify these, perhaps the most famous feat of any poet.
Wait, what is happening here? Sorry.
Can you identify those feet? Can you identify that man?
No, I can't see it very well through the
Okay,
screen,
not very
but
good, not very good. So
yeah.
if you're listening at home,
Sorry.
I'm holding up the back cover with Shel Silverstein, Where the Sidewalk Ends.
Oh, I remember that my sister had those, but I used to read those to my little sister. She's like 7 years younger than me, and I didn't really, yeah, Shel Silverstein just didn't make it into the house, I think, when I was little, and for no reason, I'm sure. Just it
Yeah.
just kind of happened like that. I remember a lot of books that I read as a kid also had like dead parents or
Oh.
absent parents, and feeling like weirdly seen by these books, like The Secret
Ah.
Garden and the Little Princess, where the father is often gone and she thinks she's orphaned, and Heidi, all of those sort of
Oh
classic
yeah.
children's literature. And I learned later that it's just like a really handy technique to give kids more freedom than they might have if they had, both parents present in the house, kind of keeping an eye on them.
Right.
You could write more interesting adventures for a kid who wasn't really being looked after very well. But I remember thinking like, oh, is this more like, I don't know. I didn't really know. I don't think I knew anybody else who had had a parent died at an early age, like friends. Most of my parents who had friends who had step parents had divorced parents, and so my father having died when I was 5 was a huge, obviously it was a pretty formative event in my life, and I remember just taking a lot of comfort from that, especially with like the kids who, as a result, were sort of unruly or felt like misfits, like they didn't fit in, and were kind of, those. So good old Mary from The Secret Garden, she was one of my favorites.
Oh yes, yes. Well, so yeah, I wonder as you got into high school, into college and beyond, what were some of those formative texts that really kind of on the both hands, where one hand is like, wow, this is incredible, I could never write like this, and on the other hand, like, I want to write like this.
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of Stephen King in high school, as you do, I think. And it is one of my all-time favorite novels. I remember just being really fascinated with the way that that Stephen King also worked like music and other pop culture references, of course, mostly ones, that were sort of a generation above me,
Sure.
into his work. But I've that really stuck with me, like, oh, that's a thing you can do. You don't have to keep those worlds separate. And so when I went into my MFA program, I got my MFA in poetry, and I was writing a lot of poems about that incorporated pop culture, which now is very standard. But in 2002, when I went into my MFA program, there was a lot of it was still like you sort of felt like you were in a bit of a niche if you were doing that. So I remember in workshop, Jeannie Thompson, one of my mentors, saying, oh, there's a book you need to read, and it's Mystery Train by David Wojan, and his book of sonnets about rock and roll and rock stars. And that book also kind of like really opened up so much for me. I thought that was an area of poetry that I had not really been exposed to yet. The sort of formal but inventive, and that took, I think what people at the time really considered like low culture and elevated it to high culture.
Right,
And now
right.
this is like so standard that it almost feels silly to be noting as a standout moment. But for me, that was major.
Oh wow. So you talk about maybe being the poet that doesn't necessarily memorize, but you probably have some of those sonnets partly memorized, right?
No, I don't. I really don't. I love hearing poems read out loud, and I love reading a poem on the page. But I have to say that like I do not have, I guess, the discipline or even the desire to memorize them and to keep that up there. Of course, also my brain is the kind of brain that's like, can sort of intimately recall a joke from a sitcom that I saw when I was 8, but where am I supposed to be in the next
same.
48 hours? I have to have a paper calendar.
Was it tried to say, sorry, tell me the last name of the poet who wrote about rock, about music?
Oh, David Wojan.
Wojan. is it
Yeah.
like tried to say like his poetry had a musicality about it, or what was it that like how was he able to combine music and sonnet? Was it like the subject matter or the form or both that were?
I think both. I mean, the sonnet is the little song, so I do think that there is a bit of a form and content meld there. But no, he wrote about music in that book like a really obsessive fan would, which is something that really resonated with me a lot. Somebody who knew not just the music, but like the mythology behind the stars and considered um their place in our culture, not just the music, but the figures themselves. And because I do think like when we think about celebrity and we think about well-known artists, it does become very difficult to separate, the figure that we adore from the artistic products that they create.
So I wonder into 2020, I was gonna say 2022, 2023, who are the writers who really thrill you, who really, challenge you in your own work and just are just a pleasurable read?
Yeah. So a book that I read last fall that I really loved was Andrew Monson's Predator. And it's an entire book about sort of looking at kind of scene by scene the movie Predator.
Okay.
And breaking down in a very serious way what's happening on screen, but at the same time using it as an instrument to reflect on violence in our culture, in masculinity, toxic masculinity, the proximity to violence in his own life. It's a very specific kind of memoir, but I thought it was brilliant. And I'm not even a Predator super fan, I wouldn't say at all. Action films aren't really my they're not my first language necessarily, but the book itself is just brilliant. And it shows, I think, that way that you could really carefully consider even what I think generally are regarded as the sort of more throwaway parts of our culture, like Hollywood blockbuster action films, and consider their impact on us, those humans who are consuming them. Like, and if you're a person who's reflective about, what does this say about me to be drawn to this violence and say to the violence in like some video games, but also to be a person who abhors violence in my actual life.
Right.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. Highly encourage everyone to pick that up. So I've been reading a lot of nonfiction lately as well. Liz Prado's Kids in America. Really, really fantastic essay collection about specifically looking at her. She's also a Gen X writer, looking at her. So I want to say, colleagues, but that's not classmates. That's the word. Her classmates from her high school, growing up, and like they're it's a great sort of like memoir and essays about growing up Gen X, but she also really looks outward, not just at her own experiences. And it's a really rich kind of portrait of I still think, good old Gen X, we're a little overlooked because we're a small generation, but and maybe a little indignant to find ourselves adults and elder statesmen, becoming elder statesmen at this point. But I really thoroughly enjoyed that book.
Is the Generation X cut off 1980, 81?
There's some quibbles about that, as most generational studies I've learned tend to be. But yeah, I would say about like 1979, 1980 is kind of the cutoff. There is this idea that there's this like micro generation also of Xennials, which is like the bridge between Gen X and millennials. That's sort of like 1977 through 82 birth years or so. I just know I was born in 76. My sister was born in 1983, and we do really feel like we are from different generations, which is kind of funny in the same family.
So I'm either the oldest of the Generation X, being born in 1980, or I'm in that, like you said, that Xennials. Okay.
I think Xennials is very handy because there are certain things about like the internet and digital culture that were still being formed. And a lot of that also had to do with like, you know, just class and access to technology. I mean, I didn't have a personal computer until I went to college. My grandparents, you know, the colonel and grandmother gave me one for high school graduation to take to, I had grandfather's hand-me-down word processor at home that in high school, which replaced the typewriter that, what key was missing on the typewriter? An inconvenient one, maybe the J.
Maybe the
so I had to handwrite in, I think it was the J, like every J on my little, you know, terrible short stories that I would write. But I did because I had a typewriter, like a real writer. Not a typewriter repair person, but a typewriter.
Remember when only like the rich people had cable? That was another market, right? You had to be rich to have cable.
Yeah. I remember, like, I mean, we had like some moments where we had cable because also geography. Like some neighborhoods were just wired before others. And then there would be these long stretches where there were depending on where we lived and like what my parents' work situation was, where there wouldn't be cable also. And then going over to a friend's house who had cable, who had MTV, and being like, can we just leave the TV on the whole time so you can absorb all of the, you know, the MTV videos, like out of the corner of your eye when you were doing whatever else.
Exactly. I wonder if like you were talking about reading a lot of nonfiction. I wonder about being the editor in chief. Like, you know, you have an editor's hat, obviously. Is it different or difficult to just read for pleasure?
Oh, good question. You know, because I also write about books, I think I read books as what it's difficult to turn off is the critic's eye.
Right.
That's really difficult for me. Yeah, which is different from an editor's eye, I think. At least it is for me. It might not be for other people. But for me, it is, I'm learning to flip that switch internally and consciously say, what if you're not working all the time? What if you can just let yourself enjoy a thing without having to ask yourself, well, why am I responding to this? And what are the elements of craft at play? And that is, I think, a byproduct of the training and the profession, and then also teaching. And it takes a lot to, for me at least, it takes a lot for me to sort of consciously say, I'm going to read something just for fun. I'm not going to write about it. I'm not going to, you know, but it's hard. It is hard because I'm always kind of, that's just how I'm wired.
Well, yes, I mean, it's great that you're a teacher, you're, you know, an educator, as well as you write. I mean, you know, publish your own things. I mean, obviously the book, but you know, for the magazine and all around, you know, it's like comparable to like a principal who just has no idea what it's like to be in the classroom. You know, it's like, I mean, you're the editor in chief, but you know, so like one of your recent ones, I think it was literally the last day of 2022 published, was about George Santos, right?
Yes.
It's very topical.
Right. And so as an editor, I work a lot. Sometimes everyone who has published a book recently and has worked with a publicist has heard, okay, so one thing that we can do to elevate your profile for this book is to place some topical essays.
Yeah, like LitHub and that kind of thing.
So I work a lot with authors and with their publicists on a lot of those sort of topical book tie-in essays. And I, you know, this is just a function of, like, you know, how the cobbler's children have no shoes. I had a book out this fall, and what I did not have was a timely topical tie-in essay. We ran an excerpt in Salon, and LitHub was gracious enough to run an excerpt as well. I had a lot of, I'm so grateful for the press that was, you know, interviews and the lists, but I did sort of feel like, you know, I know how to do this. I know how valuable it is to sort of tie your book subject into a topic that's very timely and being discussed right now. But like nothing really presented what I felt was a really natural fit until George Santos,
Lied
the
about
George,
everything.
and then everyone found out.
And everyone found out, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
And we're sitting there at work, at Salon, talking about, so this is something, of course, that we're going to cover. We have a lot of New York area readers. So on top of him being in Congress and that being already, national interest. Is this real life? Yeah. And like, how, why? And, I did see people kind of just out in the national media too, before the real like steady stream came, just the drip, drip, drip of like, is this guy even who he says he is? Excuse me. If people asking, but like, why would you just invent these things about your life? And I thought, yeah, I mean, that's a question that I had also about my father. So that the essay at that point then sort of wrote itself, which is what I think you want out of one of those topical tie-in essays. Right. Is you consider, how would this, if I'm the expert commentator on this because of the time that I've spent writing my book and what I know as a result of writing my book, this is what I have to say on this subject. So, I ultimately, where I came down on that is that I really do think that some people, I think that and I don't know George Santos or the man by any names that he goes by. Right. But I can't ask my father why he made up so many of the details about his life that he told my mother, who was both incredibly street smart and savvy at the point when she met him by necessity, but also a credulous person in love, who believed him and took him at face value. I can't ask him why he lied about the things that he did, but a lot of really what seemed to come together in the course of writing the book and learning more about him did feel like there was a sense of entitlement there, that like my life was supposed to be different, easier or more interesting, or fill in the blank there, whatever that motivation was. And so if I just lean into the person that I feel like I should be, or should have been, I can kind of create this reality around myself, and people will and people will treat me with the respect that comes with that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously his thing is deny. I mean,
yeah.
I'm sure some of it, I'm sure so much of it is being defensive, but he just, like you said, talk about the word credulous or incredulous. He's incredulous that people don't believe him.
I think that's a tactic, though, like now you can just double down and say no. And because we're not really operating on a shared reality at this point in our society, then do you believe him when he says everything about me is, all these things are lies? People sort of feel like the truth right now is just like one more option in the cafeteria. Seriously. The truth is right there next to the chickpea salad on the salad bar. And you can take the truth, or you can say, you know what, I'm going to leave it. I prefer this other thing instead.
So true. That's a great analogy. That's a great analogy. Have you ever made the chickpea analogy before?
No, just came right off the top of my head.
Oh man, that was good.
If I were writing it, I wouldn't repeat the word salad bar, chickpea salad. It would have been something else. Yeah.
the editor knew.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, baba ganoush is better than hummus for those out there. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion, right? If we're talking chickpeas.
I'm a baba ganoush fan.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I love baba ganoush.
Why can't both be good?
I get them, but this is my go-to is the hummus, the baba ganoush, and the dolmas together, like nice little mezze platter. Yeah, little olive on the side.
Heck yeah. So is it fair to say then maybe some of the seeds for the book, and I'm sure it's hard to just nail it down to one, but the book again is called Runaway: Notes on the Myths That Made Me. Was it like, like Mariel Hemingway, like around 2015? I'm just wondering about seeds for the book.
That, writing that essay so Mariel Hemingway's memoir came out, there was a leaked chapter, and I believe it was Fox News that broke it online, that it was, and at the time, I think that the idea was like, oh, Woody Allen, the liberals' darling, like, let's show him up, I mean, like how things really change over the course of several years. But Manhattan was my favorite movie for a very long time. And because I can be an awfully slow learner, I had never really thought about the fact that there is this relationship between this man, this older man, and this teenage girl at the center of it. It just hadn't occurred to me that maybe I had been watching that movie all these years for clues somehow about my parents, until it just became so obvious that it was staring me in the face. And I had this epiphany and wrote about it, and got a lot of really good responses to that. And that kind of set me on the path of thinking, why have I never questioned the, like, not the norm, not like, is this normal or not? I knew my family wasn't like standard, right? But I guess the rightness of it, or the how it had been allowed to happen. When you're young, the fact of your family is so ingrained in your sense of what the world is and means, that like, you know, I think we don't really question it immediately. It just is what it is. But, you know, being older, and then also at the same time, my oldest niece turned 13, and I really got to see from an adult perspective up close what a very smart, very poised, very articulate 13-year-old girl is like. And let me tell you, despite all of those descriptors, they're still 13, and you can tell. And that made me question the entire narrative around my mother's time as a runaway, that I had always, you know, she had always said, like, well, nobody could tell how old I was. And I thought, well, I don't know about that. I'm curious about that, if that's true. And what I discovered just through my research and through interviewing her and through talking to other people, and then looking at things like, you know, the fact that she had been arrested for being suspected runaway, is that throughout all of that time, there were always adults who clocked her kind of immediately as somebody who was not as old as she said she was. And that tension between, I think, her concept of herself, which I feel like I also remember that from when I was a teenager. You know, if you're tall and you're sort of bold enough, then like a lot of adults, at least they used to, would kind of like wave you through, you know, because, and what I've come to understand is that largely the question of, did people believe that she was an adult when she was really a kid, kind of rests on, did they have a good reason to want to believe she was an adult, or to tell themselves that she was an adult? Which is to say, did they have a good reason to sort of let that myth become the reality for them?
I thought that, like, a little bit later in the first essay, I mean, do you call them chapters? Do you call them essays? Both?
Both, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it's hard for a poet.
A little bit later on in the first chapter, you basically describe like a cognitive dissonance where, like, talking about Manhattan, the movie, you know, specifically, where it was like, but I'm gonna miss, you know, I intellectually, you know, push this movie away, but I'm kind of like, I'm gonna miss it. And you describe me like a former churchgoer, like wanting to cross back through the doors kind of thing.
Yeah,
so,
I think that, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry, just a long way of getting back to the, like, the cognitive dissonance, right? Where you talk about, like, these people knew that she was not 13, right? Or not 15 when she married your father, you know. But like you said, it's like it's cognitive dissonance, or it's a wanting to believe it, or it's a needing to believe it, right?
Yeah, because, you know, the on the other side of that is, my father did a terrible thing. And you don't want to think of your father as having done such a fundamentally terrible thing. I knew that he was not perfect. I knew that he had made a lot of mistakes. I knew that at times he could be violent. And these are things that are part of the story, but they weren't the whole story. But if the whole story really is, here's a guy in his late 30s who saw no problem with marrying a 15-year-old instead of helping her find her way back home again. That is, I mean, there was this moment where I thought, I wish I could unlearn this, but it is sort of like, once you see it, you can't not see it. It fundamentally changed how I saw my father. It fundamentally changed also then how I saw my grandparents, who I loved very much, and who we had a great relationship with growing up. But I didn't really understand the lengths that they could have gone to and did not,
right,
to bring my mom home after they found out that she was married. And that also made me see them, I think, in a bit of a different way. in that all of the adults should have taken, I think, a much greater role of responsibility.
Sure.
And instead, my mother shouldered all of that responsibility, and she did it willingly. I think she had a mindset of, you know, when you make your bed, you lie in it. And also that there was an amount of freedom that she had that she enjoyed also. And I think that, you know, part of the book, even though it's a pretty heavy book, I also wanted to show those moments where she was having fun.
Yeah.
She was having a blast, because there had to be some, it wasn't all, you know, deprivation and violence and stuff. Like, she had an adventure on the road and on the street. And that, to me, it felt important to show her having that agency too, of choosing that over safety.
Yeah, I was struck by you know, when your mom would call her mom, your grandmother, and you know, the first time she wouldn't talk. She would just let you know, let your grandma say, but just the way that your grandma would say it, hello. And I'm just thinking, like, what happened in those in between times? What happened in all that time? You know, where she wasn't there. Like, what's the, you know, I was expecting maybe grandma to be hello, hello, you know. But again, you know, she doesn't know who's, you know what I mean? She didn't know who was calling, of course. And you know, I just wondered about filling in those gaps about what she was thinking, what she was doing, and all that time.
Yeah, my grandmother was an incredibly poised, elegant woman. And you know, she was going to answer that phone. You know, this is the time, of course, before caller ID and all of that. So to that end, you know, we're less than a minute out.
Yeah.
Do
So
we
yeah.
want to?
We'll cut it off here. So